WNYC-TV presents About the Arts with Barbara Lee Diamondstein.
Hi, I'm Barbara Lee Diamondstein, and welcome to About the Arts. I'm especially pleased to welcome our guests today. One is the widely admired artist, Kenneth Noland, who is known for his remarkable ability in coalescing minimalist ideas with highly developed color principles. That's a lot to say for a man who is known for his remarkable fields of color, and perhaps Diane will tell us more about that later. I'm referring to Diane Waldman, one of the most knowledgeable curators in the United States and the curator of exhibits at the Guggenheim Museum. A warm welcome to both of you. Diane Waldman is also the curator of Kenneth Noland's first major museum retrospective, which will take place at the Guggenheim Museum from April 15th through sometime in June, and after that moves to various parts of the country. Why don't we begin, at least at part of the beginning? How does someone from Asheville, North Carolina, become so involved with art? Were there family influences? Were there educational influences? How did you wend your way north?
Well, my father was a Sunday painter, and when I was, young, I guess I had the advantage of having paint and canvas and real brushes around that I could kind of play with.
You had another advantage, and that is living in North Carolina at the point in time that you did, because I imagine it was there that you first came under the influence of Albers and Bolotowski. How did that all happen?
Well, that was after the Second World War, and the GI Bill, and I'd gone into the Air Force after getting out of high school, and so it was Black Mountain College was 20 miles from Asheville, and it was a good school.
What was happening at Black Mountain in that period? You know a great deal about that too, Diane. Who were some of the people that were there then?
Well, it was rather famous. Besides Albers, who I believe was away for most of the time that Ken was there, there was Ilya Bolotowski, who brought to Black Mountain many of the best principles of non-objective painting, which was the tradition, part of the tradition at Black Mountain, and I think played a primary influence in Ken's development. At the same time, there were other people, more or less around the same time, like the critic Clement Greenberg, the painter Bill de Kooning.
Who were the faculty at Black Mountain at that time? Were Cunningham and Cage there then?
They came for the summer sessions. I don't think we had the advantage there of having at that time, I guess, a lot of avant-garde people that would come for summer sessions at Black Mountain College, such as John Cage, Merce Cunningham, de Kooning.
Was Rauschenberg a student there at the time?
Not at the time I was there. He was there once a summer that when I wasn't there.
Diane says it was Bolotowski who was a great influence. Was it he who introduced you to color? How did that happen?
Well, no, I would think that Albers was more responsible for the interest in color at Black Mountain. Bolotowski was more an abstract kind of painter out of Mondrian. I think the interest in color at Black Mountain College was primarily due to Albers.
Well, he was the driving force behind that school. Can you tell us anything about that period that you tell us as well in that lively and very informative introduction to the catalog of Ken Noland's work that you've written, Diane.
What I find interesting about Black Mountain, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the fact that the school was highly experimental, that the principles that Albers had brought with him from the Bauhaus in Germany.
Perhaps you should tell the larger audience who we mean when we talk about Albers.
Joseph Albers was one of the foremost abstract artists who brought with him from Germany some of the then most avant-garde principles of the making of painting. His particular interest, and I think Ken is right in this respect, was what he called the interaction of color. That was his own particular obsession. What he did bring with him, I think, from the Bauhaus was the idea that the school didn't have, while it had a curriculum, it didn't have a degree program as such. It differs from the type of four-year colleges that we're used to today. So that theater, dance, painting were all of equal importance. And I believe Ken was exposed to music as well as to painting, that all of the arts, as at the Bauhaus, were considered part of one's creative activity.
How did that ever happen in North Carolina, the third rural state in this country, and whatever happened to Black Mountain College?
Well, Black Mountain College was a splinter off of a college in Florida. I don't really know too much about, except that there were some faculty members at this university in Florida that decided to break away and start a community college. I guess without the idea of having degrees, but integrating the arts in a kind of community type education.
When did you first arrive at the circle as an art form? It seems to me that your work is characterized by a penchant for geometric forms, among other things. There are circles, there are concentric bands, there are chevrons, there have been stripes. But how did you first arrive at that as a form? I know it's very difficult to talk about something that has to be visualized in a work of art, like a work of architecture is really perhaps best appreciated when it's seen, but given all those limitations, can you tell us something about that?
Well, I think it was gradual over a long period of painting, and I think the tendency towards symmetry in painting was late in the 50s and kind of emerged kind of all over the range of painting that was going on at that particular time in the late 50s. So it wasn't anything particularly unusual.
Well, perhaps you're too modest. Diane has said that Mondrian's paintings are about balanced symmetry, and Noland's are about symmetry and the center. What did you mean when you said that? How did he find the center in your interpretation?
I think that it came out of a process that began with Pollock, for example, who used to walk around his paintings and who was involved in the energy and activity of using his whole body and the gesture of a painting. I think that Ken, in many respects, was very fortunate in not being in New York in the 50s, and therefore could arrive at a sense of symmetry and form and the discovery of the center, as I call it, via Pollock in a way, but without the need for heavily or excessive abstract expressionist brushstroke. So to my mind, the form then became, as I think I tried to state in the catalog text, a necessary vehicle to allow the freedom of expression of the color. And by finding the center of the painting, one could therefore give the color alignment its optimum fluidity. I don't know if I'm explaining myself clearly enough.
I think you are. You said that Ken was lucky not to be in New York in that period. From the late 40s to the early 60s, you were in Washington. What does that do to the development of a painter when there is so much talk of being where that critical mass is? How important is it to be where other artists are at work? What were you doing in Washington during that period?
Well, I was teaching, for one thing. I mean,
where did you teach, and with whom did you work?
Well, I taught at several places, but the place I taught the longest was at Catholic University. But really what, a lot of artists think that it's important to work in New York City. I don't think it's necessarily important to work in the city, but I think you have to know about what goes on in New York, in art.
How did you find that out?
Well, just by being able to come to New York once in a while and being aware of what was going on.
Well, there were some people who introduced you to other artists, and I think Clement Greenberg was one of those people who introduced you, and then I guess Morris Louis. Can you tell us something about how that all took place? Perhaps you might tell us when you first saw the stain technique. How did that happen?
Well, obvious, well, that maybe not obvious, but well, Pollock was staining paint into canvas, and Helen Frankenthaler, who was a much younger painter, had adapted that method of making paintings from Pollock, and the way she was, it would have been difficult to paint the way Pollock painted because his form and expression were so kind of integrated, or kind of, innerly involved, that you couldn't paint exactly like Pollock because it would look like Pollock. But Helen Frankenthaler was using some of the loose kind of methods and staining color into the fabric of canvas in a way that opened possibilities.
You went to her studio?
Yeah. That's Clement Greenberg, the art critic, took Morris Louis and myself to see Helen's paintings. Not that we hadn't seen reproductions, or I had known her work before, but I hadn't known these particular pictures that we saw at that point. And we were very affected by.
What did you do when you went back to Washington after that?
Well, we did a lot of talking. We did a lot of experimenting, and loosened up, realized that there were a lot of things that we didn't have to do in order to make paintings, that there were other kinds of possibilities of making paintings that weren't the usual methods that were used by most artists. For instance, that it wasn't necessary to stretch the canvas before you painted. You could stretch the canvas after you made the picture. There has been no particular reason why pictures should have to be stretched on a stretcher before you painted them. Well, I guess it probably was in terms of subject matter and things like that.
What was the rationale that artists used in the past? Why did they continue? Was it just history?
I think
that
so.
One works on a stretched canvas?
Tradition. Fixed format, fixed scale, in most cases, easel-sized paintings, fixed subject matter. I think what the 50s did was to revolutionize that. I think Pollock's scale changed. The fact that he worked on the floor was a radical departure. The fact that he used his entire body. Then the plastic paints came in to use, and Ken and Morris Louis worked with Magna, with plastic-based paints, and that led, the technical innovations led to, or reinforced, let's say, the creative innovations. So it became possible for Ken, for example, to stain, to use pick up the texture of the nap of the canvas, to eventually to polish some of them down.
I wanted to ask
let's
you
see.
about that.
Let me just say, it's a good point. A point to that. When painting was representational, and you did drawing, like you would make figures, you would do that on a surface. But as painting gradually developed into being more abstract, and you didn't necessarily represent anything but drawing, then we became more interested, artists became more interested in, say, the canvas as material rather than a surface. It wasn't necessary any longer just to draw figures.
You said that when you and Morris Louis returned to Washington, you experimented with this stained and other, so to speak, breakthrough techniques. I can recall reading that the two of you, for a time, worked on the same canvases. Is that correct?
Well, you know, just messing around.
Where are they?
They weren't meant to be kept.
Did you?
As a matter of fact, they were probably painted on bed sheets, because it was cheaper to buy muslin and bed sheets than it was to buy canvas at that point.
But aren't they more porous? Wouldn't that percale or muslin be more porous than a canvas?
Yeah.
But the same principle, you felt, could be adapted to a different material.
Well, the idea was to practice.
While you were practicing and perfecting, Diane raised a point that I found very interesting. The whole remarkable color sense that your paintings have are not only achieved by brush and by paint, by some techniques that you have adapted to the surface of the canvas as well. What is it that you do to create some of those surface textures?
Well, you can increase the possibilities of the expressive qualities of color by changing the character of the paint, or the application of the paint, the tactility or the texture of the paint. A thick, opaque red is not the same thing as a shiny, kind of glassy red, and it doesn't have this. It doesn't visually say the same kind of thing. They say different things. So different ways of mixing paint or applying paint can be used for different expressive purposes.
And what do you do with a technological device? Do you sand the surface ever?
Yeah.
How do you do that? I don't understand what happens.
You're asking questions that you already know about.
No, I just know you do it, but I can't imagine how, by using a sanding device on a canvas, that you don't go through the canvas, that you don't distort the question, you know, the quality of the paint, that the red, not the red, the blue says what you want it to say.
Well, a lot of
I
things
wasn't really
come
leading
about.
the witness on your part.
A lot of things come about for practical reasons, like a lot of the surfaces that I used to get by, say, staining were very susceptible to getting scratched and damaged by smudge and finger marks and things. And actually, it occurred to me to buff the surface, or to rub the surface with a stiff brush, in order to roughen it so that it wouldn't be so susceptible to damage. Of course, that makes a kind of quality too. So I use floor sander, not sandpaper, but very stiff bristle brushes and a floor sander to buff or sand certain areas of color. And then I can vacuum off the dust, and it makes a very hard surface that's resistant to damage.
What concerns you most? Shape, space, color, form? What's the thing that you look for? I never and obviously I don't, understand, when does a painter know that he's finished, that that's the way he wants that painting to look?
You ask tough questions. You, particularly the way I paint, since, you know, I can shape pictures differently, or I can decide which way around to hang a painting, since it doesn't necessarily have to have a top and bottom in the inception of the painting. You can take your choices. You can maybe see 10 or 15 different ways that a painting, the shape that a painting could be. You could go on and on and on. And
Diane
at
tells
some
us,
point,
sorry.
excuse me, at some point, intuition takes over, and intuition is a kind of informed instinct. It's, and you can take your choice just by what you like.
Diane tells us that, and supports what you've just said, that in a Noland painting, it isn't until the work is hung that you know which is the top and which is the bottom, and that it requires...
True.
Sometimes not even then.
For years later.
What do you mean?
We're still playing with which way to hang the paintings.
And that does make a big difference in
Yeah.
how one reads the work,
Yeah.
too.
Absolutely.
Well, how do you decide? And also, how do you work? Do you work on the floor? Your works are too large for an easel. Do you work on the wall?
They start on the floor, and then they end up on a stretcher, and then end up on the wall. But it's not hard if there is one way that a painting is better than another way. I mean, it's kind of hard when there are two ways that it might be pretty good, or it could be the other way around too. That no way you hang it, it's not right.
I think I mentioned that it's a question of alignment and adjustment. And the color alignment, it makes that's why I said the color was so important, because the color alignment is the final deciding factor in the way in which a painting is finally hung. We were looking, for example, at some paintings today, talking about the weight, for example. In some instances, a color will pop and become too optical, depending on the way in which it's hung, in relationship to the colors that it's aligned with.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a very important consideration, I think, in the final decision as to the way in which the painting is installed.
Among the things that I've read about with great interest, both in the catalog and following your work over a long period of time with considerable interest, some of the influences. You cite Mondrian, Klee, and Matisse. Who do you cite as having most informed your vision?
Different artists at different times. You go on from the time you get interested in art, I guess as long as you live, at least I had to get more interested in old masters. And I learn more, and I can see more. And there are a lot of things that, as you're working on certain things, that certain old masters will be relevant to at certain times.
But you're going back beyond the painters that Barbara Lee mentioned.
Like Pollock and Matisse?
No, I mean,
you mean old
before.
masters, not modern old masters.
Do you mean modern masters, or do you mean someone like Ingres or Delacroix?
Ingres or Delacroix, Velasquez, Corot, Titian, Goya, Rembrandt.
Well, in this eloquent essay, Diane Waldman, a person whose sensibility and judgments one takes very seriously, has said that you are the unquestionable heir to Matisse in the realm of color expression. And for you, Diane, color is Noland, and Noland is color. Could you talk to that point for just a moment in the remaining several minutes that we have?
It's, as Ken mentioned, it's a very heavy question. I feel for myself, and again it's a personal opinion, which I hope will be shared by other people when they see the exhibition, that Ken has done more in the area of pure color than almost any painter that I know of in contemporary art. It's the type of color that Matisse understood, and but it's completely different. I'm not trying to say that Ken is the literal heir as much as the man who has the greatest ambition, to my mind, and who has achieved the most in making color totally expressive by virtue of opacity, texture, density, shapes which are both particular and yet at the same time neutral, by virtue of size, scale, measure, weight. He is, to my mind, the one painter who has taken quite seriously the real possibilities of abstract painting and explored, it seems to me, every dimension through the vehicle of color. I hope that says it.
It certainly says a great deal. I have one question. It's hard to believe, looking at you now, that your first show was nearly 30 years ago. Where was that, and what was the reception to that?
That must have, you mean, the first show I had was in Paris when I was a student on the GI Bill in 1949.
Was it widely attended and widely received?
No, there was no reception.
Well, it's a very far cry what will be happening at New York's Guggenheim Museum. I'm eager to see the show. I'm very pleased that you came to talk with us, Kenneth Noland, and glad that you came, Diane Waldman, curator of exhibitions at the Guggenheim Museum and the curator of Kenneth Noland's first major museum retrospective. You've had museum shows, including a 1965 very important show at the Jewish Museum, but never one of this size, more than 100 works, and that's largely because of their scale. The show will be in New York till the end of June. It then goes to Washington. Washington is so glad to receive what they now claim is a native son that you'll have a show both at the Hirshhorn and the Corcoran, and after that it travels throughout the rest of the country. Thank you, audience, for being with us at About the Arts today.